You know, I just have one question for Kevin Costner. Is there any good reason this wasn't a TV show? 3 hours, and all we get is the first act of 5 westerns, and there are 3 more of these things. Do I seriously have to sit through 9 more hours of this? When I first saw the trailer, I thought for sure it'd be a Kevin Costner ego trip where he's the roughest, toughest cowboy in the Old West who outshoots, outthinks, and outfights every man he meets. And then he did do that stuff, but he's also barely in the movie, because instead of focusing on one character's journey, it shotguns a bunch of stories at you all at once. You've got people trying to build a town in hostile territory, a wagon train, a lady escaping an abusive relationship, being hunted by the man's sons, a cowboy wandering the West, Native Americans reacting to the white men invading their land, bounty hunters, cavalrymen riding to the rescue. Then there's burgeoning romance, sex, murder, revenge, and more. And okay, though I can see that the point of the movie was to provide the setup for the second film in August, that was also kind of the problem. I get that when you set out to do a multiple part saga, you have to take the story in stages. All the great trilogies did it, and none better than Lord of the Rings. But with Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson managed to have each film reach a conclusion that leads into the next part, but leaves the overarching tale unfinished. That way, you get to see a proper 3-act film with each installment, but each of the 3 films functions as an act in the greater whole. Like with the original Star Wars trilogy, New Hope, Empire, and Return of the Jedi were all self-contained stories, but a part of something bigger. Horizon just feels more like it's the first 3 or 4 episodes of an 8-part miniseries that doesn't have to follow those rules because the typical 3-act structure is more fluid. You can spend the first 2/3 of your long-form TV show building various threads without giving any sort of resolution because all the payoffs come in the final 2 episodes. And judging by how Horizon Part 1 ended, it looks like Costner is going to try and cram the second and third act of these stories into Chapter 2, even though it's 20 minutes shorter, and then who knows what he's going to do with 3 and 4. But please just tell me he's not going to try and drag all of these threads out for 9 more hours. And he must have realized that it was really unsatisfying how Chapter 1 ended because the last 5 to 7 minutes is just clips of all the cool stuff coming in the second film. They literally did a 1980s Next Time On TV show sizzle reel. I will say that all of the individual tales are well written and acted. And the set design and cinematography is nice enough, even if it's a little unimaginative. But the makeup and costume design brought me up against a bit of an issue. One of the things that bugs me most about movies like this is the lack of grit. If you got people living out under the stars for weeks on end, then they ride into town with fresh clothes, it just kind of breaks my belief in the world. And even though a lot of folks do get nice and dirty, there are just way too many times when someone shows up looking like they just stepped out of the costuming tent after a hot meal and a nice shower. And Costner is the worst offender. When we first meet his character, he's coming off a few weeks riding in the wilderness, right? But there's not a speck of dust on him. He looks fresh as a daisy. And when he goes to a bathhouse to get ready for a date, all I could think was, dude, you just came from there. What else are you going to scrub? Another time was when a woman comes up from the river after doing laundry all day, and she's wearing the most sparklingly white shirt I have ever seen in my life. So let me get this straight. You spent hours in the hot sun kneeling in a river washing clothes, and that's all the dirtier you got. What, are you hiding at dry cleaners down there? It kind of breaks my suspension of disbelief when 90% of the characters struggling to survive in the Old West look like they just came from a spa. It sounds kind of minor, I know, but little things like that tend to add up and take you out of a movie. World building through visuals can add a lot to the feeling of a film. I mean, go look at The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly or Unforgiven and compare it with some Roy Rogers films and you see what I mean. The clean scrubbed cowboy look doesn't fit very well in a gritty realist pick. And speaking of adding up, okay, a lot of the acting was really good, but something just didn't work for me. There's this weird thing that clicks where you can forget you're watching actors play parts and start believing in the characters as real people. It's hard to explain, but anybody who's watched a bunch of movies learns the feel of it. And a movie like this is where you really want it to happen. But I don't know if it was the star-studded cast being distracting or what, but it was pretty rare for me to get so invested in these characters that I forgot they were just actors saying lines. On the other hand, the stories are all pretty realistic. I mean, I've read enough Western history to see that bits and pieces of real events were used as inspiration for a lot of the script. And no, it's not a documentary and the characters are fictional, but the various elements felt more real than just an author who had no idea what he was talking about writing out of ignorance. And I especially appreciated one thing in particular. All right, I'm probably going to get yelled at about this, but in modern times, there's this tendency to portray any interaction between native peoples and white folks with a very broad brush, making the indigenous tribes pure and morally incorruptible, and only showing evils being done by the white invaders. And while the historical atrocities against native peoples is unquestionably worse, there were also some pretty awful things being done on the other side of that coin. And the movie did not shy away from that. Painting one side as totally corrupt and ignoring the wrongs done by the other just steals away their humanity and turns them into a toy you can play with. By showing that there were both innocent and violent elements on both sides and showing their motivations for their actions, the movie just reminds us that a group as a whole didn't commit evils, but rather individuals or subgroups within the larger whole. Granted, yes, the atrocities committed by Americans against indigenous tribes far outweighs the horrors committed by the natives. But it is good to know your history and be willing to see that not everyone was innocent on that side. Being of both indigenous and white descent myself, I found it refreshing that Costner shied away from taking the politically correct reduction of native peoples into saint-like pawns or making white folks into bloodthirsty demons, and showed it was a bit more complex than that. Neither side came away with clean hands, but neither side is fully evil either. People can decide for themselves if Western expansion was itself evil or just the methods used, but it happened, and Costner seemed to want to show it from every angle and with every story possible. Unfortunately, that just bloats the movie and leaves it unfocused. Whether or not Chapter 2 will turn this anthological collection into a fully connected whole remains to be seen. Personally, I think he's going to pull it off. There's a lot of good stuff here. Decent directing and acting, the start to some intriguing stories, but there's nothing that begs to be seen in theaters. I'd recommend waiting until all the parts are on streaming and breaking it up into 1-hour chunks like a TV show to get some better flow. But what do you guys think? Was this 3-hour slog worth seeing on the big screen, or is it just boring? Well, let me know in the comments, like and subscribe if you want to see more reviews, and until next time, happy viewing!